It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
Nice to have you here. And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
You know, last week we asked, what will the Democratic agenda be in 2021? And it looks like one item will be voting once again to impeach President Trump. After armed insurrectionists stormed the Capitol building at the president's urging, even some longtime Trump apologists are calling for his ouster. And Twitter and Facebook have banned Trump from violating their terms of use. But Trump himself denies any responsibility, and his enablers in the GOP, like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, continue to egg on right-wing extremists who have made their violent intentions very clear. Ralph, what do you have to say about all this? Sort it out for the people.
Well, after the Trump mob stormed the Congress, it got the Democrats to impeach Trump in the House of Representatives with a few Republican supporters, but the majority of the Republicans opposed the impeachment. Now it goes to the Senate, and Senator McConnell's got a very important decision to make. Does he stick with Trump, or does he say that Trump is the past and the future of the Republican Party includes standing tall and having a trial in the Senate and letting Republicans, especially those up for re-election in 2022, vote their conscience? It's in McConnell's interest in terms of controlling the Republican Party, because he'll be the chief figure for the National Republican Party in terms of power, to basically let the Republican senators vote their conscience and convict Trump. Now, the practical effect of that, because Trump will be out of office unless he has other things planned, is that he will be prevented from ever running for any federal office in the future. And I think Senator McConnell and the Republican Party and other aspirants for the presidency in the Republican Party in 2024 have a very deep interest in not having to deal with another try by Donald Trump to go for the White House in 2024. We'll see how it runs out, but I think strategically for the future of the party, which is badly battered, the GOP, it would be much better for let the impeachment process take its course, let the Republicans in the Senate vote their conscience to reach a 2/3 total, and make sure that Trump never runs again for federal office.
And the New York Times is reporting that McConnell privately is saying he's for impeachment, I guess.
Yes, he's also said he doesn't want to ever talk to Trump again. He's been humiliated by Trump and manipulated by Trump, and even someone like Mitch McConnell apparently has a line in the sand that he's drawing. His wife just resigned a few days ago as Secretary of Transportation, which is another signal that he may be ready to distance himself from tyrant Trump. And for listeners who wonder if impeachment can continue to run its course after a president leaves office, the answer is yes. Impeachment can occur while a president is in office. Conviction after trial can occur after the president has left office, if only to prevent the president from ever running again for any federal office.
Okay. Trump is not the only executive who doesn't take responsibility for criminal conduct. Regular listeners to this show know that, unlike most other programs, we really pound the corporate crime beat, because that's where the big money is and that's where the big crime is. It's not in the streets. Hundreds of thousands of poor people go to prison every year, yet most high-level corporate executives are hardly ever held accountable for crimes committed on behalf of their companies, whether executives from Boeing or Bayer or Exxon or Pfizer. Sounds like a Sanders Reindeers list of corporations with long rap sheets on Rockwell, on Northrop, on Wells Fargo. Well, on the show today, we'll be talking with Professor John C. Coffey, a legal expert who has written a book on how to hold the corporations and the people that run them accountable for their deadly actions. And that's just the first part of the show. In the second half, we're going to move from corporate crime to corporate pay. What does upper management do to deserve to make so much more than their workers? In some cases, over 300 times more. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, it has taught us who really does the essential work in this country. And one thing's for sure, most of them aren't wearing suits. That's why we welcome San Francisco Supervisor Matt Haney, who's going to tell us about Proposition L, also known as the overpaid executive tax. This is a proposition that seeks to motivate corporations to limit the wage gap between management and their workers by hitting them where it hurts, their bank accounts. As usual, somewhere in between, we will take a break to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have any time left over, Ralph will answer some listener questions. But first, let's find out how we can hold corporations and their executives accountable. David?
Professor John C. Coffey teaches law at Columbia University Law School, where he is the director of the Center on Corporate Governance. Mr. Coffey is a leading authority on corporate governance, white-collar crime, and class actions, and has written a number of books on those subjects, including Corporate Crime and Punishment, The Crisis of Underenforcement. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor John C. Coffey.
My pleasure to be here.
Welcome indeed, Professor Coffey. I think it's fair to say that given all the reports, we're in the midst of a prolonged corporate crime wave. These reports have appeared in the New York Times, Barron's Financial Weekly, and the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. But there haven't been many congressional hearings on it, and people running for office don't make corporate crime a very prominent feature, even though the figures available show that it takes far more life and far more money from people than street crime, bad as that is. So I want to start by asking you two questions, one about the Boeing Corporation and one about Wells Fargo, in order to make it, for our listeners, very concrete before we go into numerous reforms to make corporate crime law enforcement more effective. Can you explain the recent Boeing so-called deferred prosecution agreement that culminated in a Justice Department investigation of Boeing's role in the two tragic 737 MAX crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia, which took 346 lives?
Well, basically, this is the standard response of the government. They no longer even indict the corporation, much less the executives. They enter into a probation-like disposition called a deferred prosecution agreement, under which you may pay a fine, but which you don't get the consequences of a criminal conviction. There is no guilty plea. There is no impact on civil proceedings, which would be affected by a guilty plea. And there is no other kind of civil sanction, such as loss of eligibility for various kinds of contracts. Now here, the reason generally for this is it's simply beyond the logistical ability of an average U.S. Attorney's Office to go after an international investigation. Suppose it wasn't Boeing with these tragic deaths. Suppose it was a foreign corrupt practices case in which the company has made dubious bribe-like payments in 6 or 7 countries, and now a U.S. attorney has to investigate. Well, you're going to find that you've got 6 or 7 countries involved. Dozens of employees have got to be interviewed. They speak 6 or 7 languages. No one in your office can easily go over to Bulgaria, Kazakhstan, or someplace else where the bribes were paid. All of this is a little bit beyond your logistical reach. And as a result, the defendant corporation says to you, here's what we can do. We will employ and retain a law firm which will conduct a study and report to us and to you, and based on that study and any questions you have, we'll enter into a deferred prosecution agreement. Now, that's a very diluted sanction, but it's made necessary by the logistical inability of a U.S. attorney to investigate crime that's gone across several continents, as does the Boeing case, because the crashes were in Ethiopia and in Indonesia. And when we have that kind of world, the company has leverage, and it can say, well, our condition for conducting this $20 or $30 million study is that you don't indict any of our officers, because we're all trying to help. We're all working together to solve the problem, and we ought to have the conviction expunged after 6 months, 18 months, whatever. That gets negotiated. But the result is there's only a cash penalty. And here's the really strange fact. In writing this book, we did sort of an event study of the largest 50 or so penalties that have been imposed on corporations in the last 15 years. And we found out that on the day record sentences were announced, on the announcement of a record sentence, the company's stock price went up, not down. The company is not really deterred by large cash payments. Even the $2.5 billion in the Boeing case is really pretty small in terms of the market capitalization of the company and its normal earnings. Moreover, there are other tricks that the company uses that aren't really explained. Let me take the Boeing case, where it's a $2.5 billion settlement, but only about 8% of that is a criminal penalty. It's actually $243 million out of $2.5 billion. That's the only amount on which you can't take a tax deduction for these payments. The other 92% will be deducted, and the company will get at least a 50% deduction, reducing the payment here by over half. So that's step one. Step two, they inflate where this money is going. If you look at where the money in this $2.5 billion Boeing settlement is going, $1.77 billion, 68% of the total amount, is going to large airlines as airline compensation. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong or unjust. I'm just saying large airlines are large corporations. They can protect themselves. They have very good lawyers, and they would negotiate a settlement with Boeing. Instead, this is being brought underneath this settlement so the government can claim credit for getting a $2.5 billion settlement, of which $1.77 billion is going to large corporations. Who are the real victims? The people who died, and they died abroad where they'd have great difficulty suing in the United States. They're getting only $500 million, somewhat less than 20% of this total settlement. So it's not benefiting the little guy, it's benefiting large corporations. And of course, no one is going to prison. There's not a single indictment or any censure of any named individual. The only people who are accused of having misled the government are test pilots, and their names aren't even mentioned. But frankly, it's not credible. The test pilots may have contributed to misinforming the government, but when the FAA's report was edited by Boeing, that would have been done by lawyers, not by test pilots who don't talk legal talk. So you have a settlement here, which I think is one of the worst ones we've seen. There is no executive being prosecuted or even named. There is no corporate monitor being asked to do regular surveillance of the company's activities. There are no special requirements placed on the board of directors, and there's not even been an independent study by an outside law firm to tell us objectively what really happened. All of that, to me, is symptomatic of what is a national failure in the prosecution of large organizational crime. And small organizations can get caught. Some small corporations do get indicted, but the larger ones are really beyond the government's bandwidth.
I think you make that quite clear in your book, Corporate Crime and Punishment. In the Boeing case, of course, there were congressional hearings. There was a very effective news coverage showing that the linkage between executive policy, cutting corners, trying to speed up the production line, suppressing engineering knowledge by people at the highest levels of the company. And still, all this was not brought to bear on this deferred prosecution agreement. But most people don't know that the families invoked the victim crime participation right under the federal law and were rebuked. Could you explain that?
Well, you can only get involved if there is a prosecution brought. You have a right to participate and to speak at sentencing as a victim of a crime, but there's not going to be an indictment here. There's only going to be an information, something like an indictment, that's filed, and it will be expunged at the end of the probationary period. So I don't think the individuals, and by the way, the individuals in Ethiopia and Indonesia are not in a good position to be able to come over here and participate actively.
Well, do you think that the Biden administration with the new Attorney General can reopen the case or can initiate a criminal
I think they can change policies, but unless there's a default, the only way they can walk away from the deferred prosecution agreement is if Boeing defaults, and that would be hard to show. What I do hope is that the Biden administration will go back to a policy known as the Yates Memorandum, named after Sally Yates, a former Deputy Attorney General, which would say we shouldn't have corporate prosecutions unless you have first determined all of the individuals within the company who have been responsible, and make sure you get a full report detailing the responsibility of each corporate executive. That didn't happen here. And you can't make a deal to trade. We'll let the corporation plead guilty if you let the individuals off. The Yates Memorandum insisted upon focusing on the individual officer's responsibility. The Trump administration watered that down, and it's simply not been followed. It wasn't even followed fully back under the Obama administration, but it's been abandoned by the Trump administration.
Since the deferred prosecution agreement focused on the corporation and not the executives, does that preclude a Biden Justice Department from opening or initiating an investigation of holding the executives culpable?
No, they could proceed against executives. Different U.S. attorneys, different agencies can also proceed, but they can't do anything else with respect to the company. And on the individuals, I think they don't have any information at present. They've written a statement of facts. It's attached to the Boeing deferred prosecution agreement. And all that it says is that a couple of the test pilots knew there was a problem with this wind shear, and they knew that there was a tendency for it to cause the nose to tip down even when there wasn't a high wind. But they didn't tell enough to the FAA. In fact, the FAA gave Boeing a draft report, and Boeing edited it significantly. And that could only be done by lawyers and executives who know what they want to say. The goal of Boeing was to make sure there didn't have to be a higher level of instruction given to new pilots, to pilots who would fly this new aircraft. They wanted to keep it at what they called the level B training and not require a higher level of training, which may have saved a lot of lives, but they didn't require it, and that made it a more competitive plane for Boeing to sell, because new training meant delay and made your product less competitive. The misrepresentations effectively convinced companies that they could buy this without giving their pilots new training.
Tell our listeners the grieving families have filed civil lawsuits, tort lawsuits against Boeing to demand and try to collect compensation. And can they use any of the material that the Justice Department has brought together?
They can certainly use it and try to get the documents the Justice has, but they don't have that much material. They have maybe some statements from Employee 1 and Employee 2, but frankly, test pilots can't pay a judgment. They might be able to be sued for some thousands of dollars, but not for the billions that you'd want to give effective compensation.
And does the grand jury proceedings accessible?
Well, a grand jury proceeding is probably not going to be accessible. You were referring earlier to information that Justice had in its files, and that could be turned over. There's no sealing of Justice's files, but grand jury records are very rarely can you get access to grand jury records.
Now, there's another approach that the Justice Department has used, which you talk about in your book, Corporate Crime and Punishment, the Crisis of Underenforcement. We're talking with Professor John Coffey, Jr., Columbia Law School. That is the non-prosecution agreement, which Congressman Jamie Raskin wrote about in a letter to the Justice Department a few months ago, demanding the disclosure of these non-prosecution agreements. In other words, the Justice Department under William Barr has been making non-prosecution deals and not putting out press releases, as was the norm by prior Attorney General.
Well, also, you're taking the judge out of the process. In a typical deferred prosecution agreement, the case is given to a judge, and the judge can be a referee of any dispute. In a non-prosecution agreement, it's just a contract between the Department of Justice and the defendant corporation, so that we don't have any oversight at all. And the defense bar has pushed more and more to use non-prosecution rather than deferred prosecution agreements. And they have become at least as common as the deferred prosecution agreement.
And they're now secret. You have to file a Free Information Act to try to get them. What's left when you have a non-prosecution agreement? What kind of enforcement is left on the table?
Well, the government can negotiate for any rights it wants. In fact, some companies might prefer a deferred prosecution agreement because then they at least have a judge as a neutral referee. But generally, once you get the agreement signed, the prosecution can take credit. They don't want to go back and examine the details. Prosecutors are good at trials, but they're not so good at implementing a huge settlement involving a multi-billion-dollar company and thousands of employees.
Well, in your book, you make numerous observations on the small budgets of these regulatory agencies and the corporate crime section of the Justice Department. They're really outmatched enormously by these giant corporate law firms. Some of these law firms have more partners than the entire Justice Department Antitrust Division, for example. So before we get into that, let's move to a really astonishing non-prosecution of the culpable executives, the Wells Fargo fraud, which involved thousands of Wells Fargo employees and millions of Wells Fargo customers. Can you explain the multiple fraud and why there hasn't been any criminal prosecution of Wells Fargo executives.
Well, again, I think it is largely the huge difference in scale. You're talking about a bank with hundreds of offices around the country. At all those hundreds of offices, the individual low-level bank employees were faced with a compensation program under which they were only going to get good compensation if they could get their customers to subscribe to other Wells Fargo services. And to do that, they sometimes signed their customers up without their consent. They didn't know that they had been given Wells Fargo accounts of this kind and that kind, and they got charged fees that they didn't understand. Many customers don't understand that complicated bank statement that comes in the mail every day. Now, customers have now learned what Wells Fargo was doing, and there has been some customer loss. People have moved away. The senior management was eventually fired by the board, but no senior manager has been criminally prosecuted. There are one or two cases that are still being examined, but justice never says we've ended this. They just say we're still considering, and 5 years later it's obvious that nothing is going on and the statute of limitations will run pretty soon.
The fines were not very sizable. There were several $1 billion, and as you imply, the corporation, once it reaches a certain size, is a spectacular cost transfer operation. It can transfer costs.
There's two elements. Let me take you a step further. Even if we imposed huge fines on the corporation, that would have two consequences. It might cause the corporation to lay off employees, pay less money to local communities and taxes, etc., all of which harm innocent stakeholders. But it does very little to large shareholders. Who owns large banks? Basically diversified institutional investors. Basically pension funds and mutual funds. They don't have more than 1% of their assets invested in any one large corporation. And so they, being diversified, don't feel the pain very harsh, and it doesn't have much of a deterrent impact. That's the point, again, that the stock market price goes up even when record penalties are imposed, because the stock market is looking at the fact that this criminal episode is now over and they can get back to business as usual.
By the way, listeners, in the Wells Fargo situation, it's even more egregious. They actually had quotas, the low-level staff of Wells Fargo, and they were pushed to sign up customers for auto insurance and credit card accounts without their knowledge. I mean, it's hard to see something more willful that wasn't initiated at the top, wouldn't you say?
It was a pervasive low-level fraud. They were requiring, if you wanted to get the level of compensation you wanted to get, you had to get so many accounts signed up, and those who were pressured responded to pressure by signing up customers without their consent, either to credit cards or to auto insurance. And the auto insurance wasn't close to being competitive with other forms of auto insurance.
Well, I think one of the things that prompted you to write this book is that since 800 or so savings and loan executives were prosecuted and convicted and sent to prison over 20 years ago, there's been a remarkable decline in immunity in major executives of companies not being criminally prosecuted. The collapse of the Wall Street situation in 2008-9, and some low-level people, no significant executives were ever prosecuted by the Obama administration. And so you have this elaborate system. It's actually very specific on how to proceed to make the executives of corporations accountable, which is the best deterrent, rather than to allow the continual practice now of just going after the corporation. Can you explain some of the changes that you're proposing here?
Well, let's go through a number of things. You're right that essentially a corporation can absorb a criminal fine as a cost of doing business. And frankly, other studies have shown that total fines imposed on corporations don't come to really 1% of their market capitalization. That is a cost of doing business if it's only 1 or 2% of your total market capitalization. Now, the ways in which I would try to change things, let's take a strategy that has worked. Whistleblowers. Whistleblowers can now be used by a couple of federal agencies, the SEC, the Commodities Future Trading Commission, the IRS. I would want all of the federal government's agencies being authorized to pay the whistleblower, being required to pay the whistleblower a percentage of the penalty that's ultimately levied. So only the successful whistleblower will get paid, but he'll get a real percentage of the penalty. It's 10 to 30% in the case of the SEC, and that will give us a new source of information. People do respond to the chance of getting rich, and the SEC is overloaded with these whistleblower complaints right now, but they're only one agency, and the U.S. Attorney has every much as much the interest in getting information from insiders, which would greatly reduce the logistical mismatch that we now have. Secondly, even when we have a deferred prosecution agreement, I want to do something else. I want to be able to affect all of the executive officers of the company, not just the one or two that might have been guilty of a crime, because many others are aware of the noncompliance and have welcomed the noncompliance that increases profits. One thing that I think we should do is place a company in a deferred prosecution agreement on probation, and under a probation agreement, they would be denied the ability to pay incentive compensation to their executive officers. No stock option bonuses, no special large incentive bonuses. What that would do would give employees a very different incentive. They would now want the company to be law compliant in order that they could continue to receive incentive compensation, stock options, and bonuses. We've got to find a way to spread the penalty beyond the low-level employee who occasionally gets indicted and make sure the company as a whole has an officer corps that sees its self-interest as being associated with law compliance rather than with law disobedience.
And what about the bounties? You propose bounties here.
Well, whistleblower bounties, yes, we have that system at a couple of agencies, and it's worked quite well, but I think it should be part of the criminal justice system as well. If you were an employee and you know that you could get 10% of $1 billion fine, that's the kind of numbers that will cause people to give information on a platter to the U.S. Attorney. We've got to change the incentives so that people want to report rather than to hide.
Do you know, listeners, there's been a law in the books for many years called the False Claims Act, which has allowed whistleblowers claiming fraud on the federal government, and if the Justice Department picks up their case, they can collect significant percentages, maybe as high as 30%. Of what the government disgorges. And this has totaled over $75 billion since the bipartisan effort by Senator Grassley and Congressman Berman passed the bill.
Well, the False Claim Act actually goes back to Abe Lincoln. It was his idea.
Yeah.
It's been around for a long time, and it does work, but it requires the individual to sue, which means you've got to find a plaintiff's law firm that will take it on a contingent fee basis, because it's going to be expensive to sue a large corporation.
Let's look at the situation from the government side. And before we go into the incentives and disincentives of prosecutors to do the right thing, and a lot of them leave with their skills and join these big corporate law firms where they make $1 million literally or more a year, let's look at the budget shortfall. Corporate attorneys know that if they can lobby Congress to restrict the budget for law enforcement, fewer investigators, fewer prosecutors, etc., they can get away with relieving their corporate clients of considerable accountability. Now, Professor Malcolm Sparrow at Harvard, an applied mathematician, is the expert on billing fraud in the healthcare industry, and he states that the most conservative estimate he can come up with is that 10% of all healthcare expenditures are defrauded by computerized billing fraud and abuse, which is about $360 billion this year, billion. And the best we can estimate is that 60 billion of that comes out of Medicare. They defraud Medicare. And less than 2 or 3 billion is recovered by the Department of Health and Human Services. They have very few people. What would you recommend in terms of expanding the federal enforcement budgets against corporate crime?
Well, certainly I want to expand the budget, and here it's less the Department of Justice that gets starved to death than the civil agencies. The SEC, for example, has had its budget largely frozen over the last 4 or 5 years, and they no longer are making a priority of suing publicly held corporations. This is the Trump priorities. The SEC has been shifting towards protecting individuals from crime on Main Street and not Wall Street. But it's the large entities, the large banks and the large underwriters that have the ability to put in place the largest frauds or the largest misconduct. And the SEC's priorities have turned away from suing large corporations and instead are focusing on small broker-dealer problems. I think you got to look at the size and the potential for massive harm when you make your priorities. But the Trump administration has moved away from Wall Street and turned instead to smaller entities on Main Street. That's just one agency. So again, I think you can economize on the budget if you give the government the information cheaply, which whistleblower bounties would do. And I think you can also use sanctions that will affect employees that aren't going to be criminally prosecuted, but do have knowledge of the crime. They are aware something is going on. They won't be criminally prosecuted under any system, but if we could restrict things like incentive compensation by saying a company that is convicted can no longer award large bonuses to its employees, that will respond to the problem you were also referring to earlier about the huge disparities in executive compensation, where the range can be 300 to 1 between the CEO's salary and a low-paid shop floor worker salary.
Well, if you were asked by the Judiciary Committee of the House and Senate to recommend adequate budgets for enforcing corporate crime, given your knowledge of the range of corporate crime, what kind of criteria would you
Well, here's the first
want?
thing I would do. The SEC imposes lots of penalties. Where does that money go? It goes into the federal deficit. It just goes to the Treasury and reduces the federal debt. If the SEC could keep some percentage of the fines that it imposes, it would be better able to prosecute. So the successful agency would get more money if it kept a percentage of those fines, not all, but a percentage, so that we'd have self-funding. You, in effect, pay as you go. You get someone convicted, you get $1 billion fine, and you get to keep 10% of it in your budget. That would incentivize the agencies to go after cases in which there are large penalties that are possible.
The government does collect substantial fines. I mean,
but they don't go to the agency that's the enforcer.
Right. That's right. And in fact, in page 95 of your book, you have a graph where in 2014, the government collected $45.5 billion just in the financial enforcement area, not the enforcement on the pharmaceutical industry. It went down to $19 billion in 2016. So you're right. I mean, just tell us what the entire budget of the SEC is so we can have a comparison here.
I don't know on the top of my head the SEC's budget for the last couple of years, but they've been largely frozen. On an inflation-adjusted basis, the SEC is getting about the same budget in terms of the size of market capitalization as they were in the 1960s and 70s. We have to recognize that as the market gets bigger, as there are more banks, more underwriters, more deals, more transactions, we are going to have more enforcement and more surveillance.
I think diverting some of the fines into the enforcement budgets of these agencies would eliminate the argument that we don't want to cost the taxpayer additional money.
No, the company would be paying for it itself.
That's right. And the Federal Trade Commission, for example, annual budget is under $400 million, and the Occupational Safety and Health Agency budget is about $500 million. So you can see how substantial diverting some of these fines would be to get some law and order and to get more deterrence against corporate crime, which is not just financial, but affects the health and safety and environmental area, auto safety area, and so forth. But you point out in your book that these companies often are not paying fully the fines that are assessed. How serious is that?
Well, for instance, fines that are imposed on a broker. The broker can just leave the industry, switch from being a securities broker to being a real estate broker, and the government doesn't go after and collect those fines. The guy who is criminally convicted often is bankrupt and isn't going to be able to collect those fines. You got to focus on the entity principally, and it's the entity where you can collect a large fine.
What more needs to be done to collect the fines? Do you have any idea how much is uncollected?
Well, the percentage is quite low. I mean, we're talking around The SEC, maybe half the fines are not collected. There are statistics on that, but I don't have total recall of them right now. It's because the individual can just leave the industry. He's barred from the industry, but he can find a different way to commit fraud. A real estate broker can be as bad as a securities broker, and he can move from one to the other. So I do think you need to have more money based on a kind of contingent fee-like basis. Contingent fees work with lawyers, and they can work for agencies as well, that you get a fee based on your success in collecting fines, or a portion of the fine. I also, again, think we need sanctions that go beyond just the employee who gets indicted, because prosecutors are always going to be careful, and they should be careful about who they indict. But for every person who's indicted, there are 20 more executives that were aware the crime was going on, and that's why a broader sanction, such as denying incentive compensation to the senior executives of a convicted corporation, would change the incentives greatly within the firm. There would no longer be the same willingness to take risks, because you assume it's only going to be the low-level guy at the street level who's going to get indicted.
Well, you argue quite persuasively that because of the short budgets of these enforcement agencies, hiring out on a contingent fee large plaintiff law firms has worked. You want to elaborate on that?
Certainly. When the bank failures occurred in 2008 and 2009, some of the banking agencies wanted to go after the boards of directors of these insolvent banks. Lots of banks did collapse, and of course Lehman was a classic example. And several of the major banking agencies, such as the FDIC, hired major law firms. I think one of the biggest such examples was Quinn Emanuel, a plaintiff's law firm. And they have regularly come in most of their cases, and gotten settlements of $70 or $80 million, partly because senior executives are insured by a D&O insurance policy. So that getting these policies pays back to the agency some of the losses that they incurred. And I do think those kind of civil suits make sense, but the agency itself doesn't have the resources to be able to bring all this litigation. Therefore, they've got to hire outside plaintiff law firms to do the cases they can't afford to try themselves. The answer to the mismatch problem is that the government has got to get an ally, and they can hire plaintiffs' firms that are equally capable and do successfully deal with large defendant firms all the time.
Well, there's another area that I didn't see covered in your book, although I may have missed it. I read every page, is that a lot of these agencies, like the FAA and the Auto Safety Agency, NHTSA, do not have criminal penalties at all in their statute, so they couldn't bring criminal cases.
Well, the agency itself can never bring a criminal case, any agency. Even though there are criminal penalties for securities fraud, it's only the Department of Justice.
Yes.
We don't allow civil agencies to bring criminal penalties. We want prosecutorial discretion. We want a central Department of Justice with some oversight of what's going on.
No, I understand that. But the point is that the Justice Department cannot criminally prosecute the auto companies for willful and knowing violation of safety standards that resulted in law of life, because there's no criminal penalty.
They can't do it as well as they might be able to do. I agree with you in that sense. But they can use the fraud penalties, wire fraud, mail fraud, and various other statutes. So there are cases in which if you lie to the government, make a material mistake, there are various penalties. 1001, which is the crime under which Martha Stewart was convicted. Anyone who makes a materially false statement to a government agency can be criminally prosecuted.
Well, you should know that Senator Blumenthal is very concerned about this. He's proposing legislation to have criminal penalties across the board in all regulatory statutes.
I'm not opposed to that. I think, though, as long as it's the Department of Justice that's enforcing that.
Yes, of course. The other thing that's interesting is, why don't the regulators ask Congress for more money for enforcement than they do? They sort of just operate on a status quo here.
Well, I think there's a negotiation. They know if they'll get just laughed at if they ask for a 50% increase. They're going to be told, show us that you prosecuted more people or you did more before you get a larger budget. And, of course, we have different kinds of administration. Money flows to enforcement agencies more under Democratic administrations than under Republicans. And I think one of the first things that should happen is that agencies like the SEC and other consumer protection agencies should get an increased budget, because they were placed on a very lean diet over the last 4 years.
Tell me this, the Justice Department's move against Boeing was based on fraud, not on criminal liability.
That's criminal. I mean,
Yeah.
if you are suing people for mail fraud or wire fraud, that's been one of the favorite
Right.
prosecutorial weapons of the government since as
Right.
long as we've had the Department of Justice.
Yeah, it's criminal fraud, but it's not
Mhm.
criminal violation of safety statutes because the FAA doesn't have a criminal penalty.
Yes. Again, there are ways they can use false statements to a government agency and where they can use obstruction of justice. There are other techniques you can use, but you are correct. They would have more arms and they would have more weapons if there was a broader regulatory violation statute.
Well,
A knowing and willful violation of a government regulation probably should be something that could be indictable.
Well, we've been talking with Professor John Coffey, Jr. of Columbia Law School, who's had experience in government regulation as well as other tasks. He's written this book, Corporate Crime and Punishment, The Crisis of Underenforcement. It's only about 152 pages, listeners, and I'm sure that you will see it as a very engrossing read and one that might motivate you to demand that your senators and representatives start having public hearings now that the Democrats are controlling the Congress in the White House. Thank you very much, John, for all your work, and we look forward to significant reforms on Capitol Hill.
Well, thank you, Ralph, and you usually are the cause of major reforms.
Thank you.
We have been speaking with Professor John C. Coffey. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break. When we return, why does your boss make so much more than you do? Well, we're going to talk to someone fighting for pay equity. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 15, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. In a nearly 12,000-word cover story for New York Magazine this week, American journalist Nicholson Baker supports the idea that the virus that causes COVID-19 was tampered with by scientists in Wuhan, China, and that it was this virus that accidentally escaped from a lab in Wuhan and killed about 2 million people worldwide. I keep returning to the basic puzzling fact, he writes. This patchwork pathogen, which allegedly has evolved without human meddling, first came to notice in the only city in the world with a lab that was paid for years by the U.S. government to perform experiments on certain obscure and heretofore unpublicized strains of bat viruses, which bat viruses then turned out to be, out of all the organisms on the planet, the ones that are most closely related to the disease. What are the odds? For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman. And Ralph, why does your boss make so much more than you do? Our next guest has been fighting for pay equity in San Francisco. David?
Supervisor Matt Haney is a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, where he represents the city's 6th district, including the Civic Center, Soma, and the Tenderloin. He is the co-founder, along with Van Jones and Jessica Jackson, of #Cut50, a national organization with the goal to end mass incarceration with smarter solutions to keep communities safe. Supervisor Haney also regularly represents tenants as an eviction defense attorney. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Supervisor Matt Haney.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Welcome indeed, Supervisor Haney. You passed overwhelmingly in the San Francisco City Council an ordinance called the Overpaid Executive Tax, formerly known as Proposition L. Can you explain that?
Sure. So this was on the ballot this past November, and it passed by over 65% of the vote in San Francisco. What it does is pretty simple. It puts a tax on large companies that pay their top paid executive over 100 times their median worker. And it's expected to bring in over $100 million a year to San Francisco, which we're going to put into our underfunded public health system. You know, we here in San Francisco truly have a tale of two cities in terms of the inequality. And this is one of, I think, many solutions that we need and to make sure that folks are paying their fair share and that we directly address the inequities even within companies where folks are making tens of millions of dollars and underpaying their workers.
Now, the surcharge is 0.1%, which seems to me to be very, very tiny. What does that involve in terms of dollars for every $1,000 of excessive pay?
Well, it depends on how much a company is making in business taxes. It's a 0.1% increase in their business tax on all of the business they do in San Francisco, which can be pretty significant. There will be some companies that may pay tens of millions of dollars if they are paying their CEO an exorbitant amount of money. So it really depends on how much they're making in the city. It goes up if there's a higher rate of excessive pay. So companies that have a 400 to 1 or 500 to 1 rate would actually pay more than those who have 100 to 1.
And the tax falls on the company or the executives?
The tax falls on the company. We, unfortunately, one of the things that they've done in California, which I think is very harmful, is we're not allowed to have a local income tax. So I can't tax that individual. With that said, it also allows us to put the tax on companies that have very high paid executives that aren't in San Francisco. So this isn't just on companies that are based in San Francisco. It's also on companies that have this exorbitant pay ratio, but may have a CEO that's based in another city.
Basically, it starts out at 0.1%. Is that correct?
Correct. Their overall business revenue in San Francisco, which could be in some cases is in the hundreds of millions or billions even.
And what's the sales tax in San Francisco? Ordinary people walking into stores buying necessities.
I believe it is 8.5%.
That's quite a difference. 8.5% on ordinary folk and 0.1% under this ordinance. Do you have any companies or executives threatening to leave San Francisco?
Oh, all the time. And, I think these are often empty threats. They, like in many places, have a very good deal here in the city. I think in a lot of ways, they've had the red carpet rolled out for them, at the expense of the rest of the city. We have seen at the same time as tech has exploded and other large businesses have exploded and made more money than ever in San Francisco, inequality has gotten worse, displacement has gotten worse, homelessness has gotten worse. And so, I agree with you that this is just one of the steps. And in fact, I think we need to take much bigger steps. We weren't sure exactly how voters were going to respond to this, but the fact that they responded so overwhelmingly positive, over 65% at one in nearly every precinct in San Francisco, including in very wealthy precincts.
To make clear to our listeners, the surcharge is 0.1% per factor of 100 times the wages in the typical local worker. It goes to 0.6% as a maximum. Mm-hmm. And so top earners making 200 times more than the average worker in San Francisco would pay a 0.2% tax. Has any of this already been collected?
Not yet. It'll be collected in the next tax year because we have to put it out. So it'll be collected next year. It just became law. It is a tax on their overall business revenue. So it isn't a tax on just the salary that they're paying to these individuals. It would be, if a business is doing, billions of dollars of revenue in San Francisco, they would pay this tax on all of that if they have this disparity.
Oh, I see. In other words, the ratio of executive pay to an ordinary worker's pay in the company is the measure that triggers the tax on the overall revenues of the company.
Exactly. Sorry.
And is it just the revenues generated in San Francisco or all over the country?
Yes, it's just on the business revenue that they do, what we call their gross receipts here in San Francisco, which, is much larger for companies that are based here, like a Uber or a Twitter or companies like that. We do have a lot of large companies that are based here. It's not a tax on their national or international revenue, but I think it is. We hope that this will be replicated at the state level, so they could do a similar thing on all of their state business tax, and then really this should be a foundation and expanded at the national level. I know Bernie Sanders has introduced a similar type of measure as of other House members.
Any chance that Governor Newsom and the California legislature will pick this up statewide?
Well, it's one of those things where they've introduced it a couple of years in a row now, but it's gone nowhere. And I hope that they will look at what happened in San Francisco and maybe they'll pick it up. I mean, it's hard to argue, right now, of course, there's an anti-tax rhetoric that businesses are struggling. Well, the reality is small businesses are struggling. Big businesses are doing better than ever, especially these businesses that have had their top paid individuals because of stock compensation, everything else, are, more billionaire than they've ever been. So we shouldn't be in as you know, what better than anyone, we shouldn't be speaking from a place of scarcity. We are massively wealthy here in California and in San Francisco.
What about San Jose or in Los Angeles picking up the same type of initiative proposition?
I hope so. Really, sometimes San Francisco does something that's viewed as crazy, and then everybody does it, and it's normal. I hope that this becomes, not only as it expanded to other cities, but as you've said, that it actually should be a higher rate.
Was there a reason you didn't try to get it passed through the San Francisco City Council instead of going to the people by initiative?
We, as a product of Prop 13 and other terrible things in California, we have to go to the ballot for any taxes. So we cannot pass revenue measures at our board. I had to pass it through the board and then put it on the ballot. So it needed to go to the people. We weren't exactly sure how they were going to respond, but they responded overwhelmingly positive. And I think we had a bit of the big businesses and a bit of a checkmate around opposing it, because in other contexts, they've been, saying that they're struggling. Well, it's hard to argue that if you're paying your top people tens of millions of dollars.
Well, there is initiative right in many cities around the country. In New England, there's the town meeting form of government. What would you recommend to our listeners? Can you help them get started if they want to do the same thing in their city or town?
Absolutely. I think it's a fairly straightforward, easy thing to do. Businesses that have 100 to 1, you could be hitting the same businesses as we are, but for the tax revenue, the business receipts that they're doing in your city. So
are you having any trouble determining how much of a company's revenues occurs in San Francisco? Is the sales tax data enough for that?
I think what will be challenging in some cases, and we'll see how this goes, is determining their top paid person. And if they try to hide that in some ways or make that more challenging, there have been federal laws, Dodd-Frank and others, that have allowed that information to be public for publicly traded companies, which is hugely important. We really couldn't do this if it wasn't for that. But for non-publicly traded companies, we're going to have to force them to disclose who their top paid person is. And we might not have that information directly because that person might not be in San Francisco. In fact, they could be in another country. I mean, it's
that could be costly compliance, isn't it? I mean, that takes a lot of person hours in the San Francisco government, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty confident that we will be able to enforce it. I mean, there's been a lot of predictions about ways that companies will try to get around it, and they certainly find ways to get around a lot of taxes, and this one is a new one. But we'll see, and if we have to, we will better target it or amend it to make sure it's capturing who we want to capture.
You think a statewide initiative would win with such a compelling margin as occurred in San Francisco?
I think this will win anywhere. I mean, I think, as you know very well, the populist economic message resonates for people across the political spectrum, across the country. People do not think that CEOs should be making hundreds or 1,000 times more than the workers, and they are in a huge number of cases. And I think that the public wants us to reel that in, not only in San Francisco, but I think this would pass in actually most states in the country. I think probably Republicans would support this.
Well, you estimate that it'll raise $140 million a year in San Francisco, and where is this money going to be used?
So I was very public with folks that I thought it should be used in our health system to address some of the inequities that are associated with economic inequality, including around untreated mental illness and homelessness. But the money goes to the general fund, so we will not be required to use it in any specific way.
Might be used in San Francisco for affordable housing, don't you think?
Affordable housing, I mean, there are so many consequences to this type of inequality. I mean, we got, of course, a lot of folks are saying this was an example of us being anti-tech, except if you actually look at it, this is pushing to have tech workers or people who work at these companies actually be paid fairly. So it's not anti-tech, it's exorbitant levels of pay for one or two people in a company. It doesn't, if I worked in tech, I would be more for this than anything, because.
Well, you might want to respond to that argument by asking your critic whether the critic knows how much the federal government gives subsidies to these high-tech companies, such as the R&D research credit to Intel and Cisco and others, for doing what they should be doing anyway. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars of tax escapes over the years. So that tends to fortify the kind of equitable initiative that you got passed in San Francisco last year. Now, if anybody wants to do it in their city, What's your contact information?
They can contact me in my office, matt.haney@sfgov.org, or look me up on the Board of Supervisors website. And if we can get other cities to do this, other states, then it really will affect the economic system in a more structural way. I think in San Francisco, what's likely to happen is they just pay the tax, and we're happy to receive the revenue and use it. But if we want to change the economic structure, it needs to be a national, and that can start with a bunch of cities and states.
And so, listeners, if you can get any more information or encouragement from Matt Haney, that's Supervisor Matt Haney, Haney, go for it. Or ask Senator Bernie Sanders for information. He's introduced a bill in Congress. Let's hear some rumble from the people out there, because this is a winner. This is not pie in the sky. This is a winner. The government reduces the taxes with all kinds of subsidies, handouts, giveaways, bailouts to all these companies, and they've got to be required to do a little bit of their fair share, although there's a lot more that needs to be done than simply Proposition L in San Francisco, as I'm sure you'll agree. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming on the program. We've been talking with San Francisco Supervisor Matt Haney, who spearheaded the Proposition L, called the Overpaid Executive Tax Act, and it passed with 65% majority. Thank you very much, Matt, and I hope it goes statewide in California. And you know the old saying down east here, when it starts in California, it tends to move east.
Let's hope so on this one.
We've been speaking with Supervisor Matt Haney. We will link to his page at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Professor John C. Coffey and Supervisor Matt Haney. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
For a copy of The Day the Rats Vetoed Congress, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And also check out the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, Classic Recipes from Lebanon and Beyond. We will link to both of those.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for listening. Why not give a copy of Professor Coffey's book, Corporate Crime and Punishment, to your local library? People will learn about corporate crime. They'll relate it to their daily livelihoods and their daily abrasion of rights that they possess, and call for stronger enforcement. It'll be one of a kind. Your library will welcome it.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up, where we talk more with both of our guests. First, an extended conversation with John C. Coffey about corporate crime.
Well, you mentioned the GM ignition switch defect, which resulted in a number of deaths. The district attorney in New York, which brought the case against GM, refused to file a criminal case because he said he didn't have the authority. And some observers said, what do you mean? They lied to the federal government. They didn't tell the truth under Title 18. Well, that didn't persuade him. And so
that was, again, a deferred prosecution agreement.
Yes.
And that's they may give various reasons, but I think the logistical mismatch is the biggest problem. You're sitting there with the U.S. Attorney in New York, have many crimes going on, and you can afford maybe to allocate 2 or 3 assistant U.S. attorneys to this case. And they're up against a law firm with 150 lawyers ready and willing to work on this case if the defendant will pay. And it may be that the investigation has to stretch over a couple of continents.
Yes, the tragedy there, it's worse than tragedy, is he fined GM $900 million, and GM just took it out of the bailout money, billions of dollars that were left over from the government bailout of GM. It's truly a formidable task. You try to figure out ways where you can get the corporation to turn in 1 or 2 of its top culpable executives. And I wondered what you meant when you said the corporation. Are you talking about the board of directors? What if the CEO is involved?
Look, right now, I want to take the company's negotiating position out of the hands of the CEO and give it to the audit committee of the board. The CEO is always self-interested in any corporate investigation. He does not want that investigation going up to the ladder and coming near his office. And therefore, he, as at the outset, is going to want to settle, often settle quickly and pay a substantial fine in some cases, in order that the investigation not get started and go up the ladder. If you gave the ability to handle this investigation to the audit committee and told the audit committee the only way you could avoid a very substantial penalty was turning in some mid-level or senior executives, not just the junior employee. We've got to get the corporation having interests different than the culpable employee. Right now, we have the company wanting to cover up for the employee. We want to give the corporation incentives so we can say, I can save immense penalties if I turn this employee in.
Let's talk about more drastic penalties and see what your view is on this. One of them is to remove the board of directors in a really serious recidivist pattern of crime by the corporation and throw it into a trusteeship. So it's not just like an environmental crime, it would be an environmental trusteeship where you'd put trustees in charge to rehabilitate the company. And the second one is to withdraw the charter of the corporation, which is its constitutional arrangement with the state.
Look who the penalty falls on. I don't want the burden of these penalties falling on the bottom level stakeholders, the employees, the local community. There might be a community that's sort of a one-horse town. There's one mill and only that in town, and if you withdraw the charter and shut the company down, everybody is laid off. No one's going to pay the school taxes. I think we need to be able to find a way to focus the penalties on executives and large shareholders, not on creditors, employees, surrounding communities, and everyone else, retired pensioners, and everyone else who's a stakeholder in the company.
No, I understand that fully, and you make that point very well.
My way of doing that would be to say, well, we need to use really large penalties. Let's not use the cash penalty. Let's use a stock penalty. If a company, because it had been involved in very serious misconduct, had to pay a fine, which might be as high as $5 or $10 billion, pay it instead in shares of your stock. And they would be restricted so that you couldn't dilute your stock further. What that would do would make the penalty fall only on the shareholders who would be diluted, but it wouldn't affect the creditors or the employees. And right now, when a judge is looking at a harsh sentencing, the defense counsel comes in and says, Your Honor, if you impose that kind of penalty, we're going to have to shut down these plants, and all these poor workers will be laid off, and they'll be homeless.
What I was suggesting was something different, replacing the governance of the corporation, keeping it open and not inflicting penalties on innocent employees and others that rely on the company. Just replacing the board of directors.
I think you can give the company strong incentives to examine management and see who they should remove. And management does get removed in a number of cases. Look, for example, you mentioned Wells Fargo, and the CEO and other high executives were eventually replaced by the board. But I'm nervous about the idea of imposing trustees. Running a business is a sophisticated professional operation, and I don't think we can safely throw out the board and put in a group of trustees. There's going to be too much political overtones to who gets on that board and who gets replaced. I would prefer to have us focus on replacing management and using probation as a means for penalizing those managers who were found to be responsible.
Of course, sometimes, like in the Boeing case, it was a trophy board. There wasn't really anybody who was skilled in aerospace engineering and safety.
No, but notice they did fire the CEO of Boeing. I mean, you are in danger. The CEO can well be forced. He couldn't get the company into negotiations, and he couldn't work out a system with the government, and they eventually replaced him with someone else. And I think that kind of transition is desirable.
Yes, but I think based on my examination, the board was very responsible for what happened. They showed no interest in asserting their governing power. After all, that's the governance location, the board of directors. And they had, trophy members. They were clueless about the crashes. They gave executive compensation bonuses after the Indonesian crash. And so we still have the same board. So
we also have to focus here on the large institutional investors who control them. I think there are responsible institutional investors like the BlackRocks of this world, which are now pushing much more for environmental controls and climate change protections and greater inclusiveness on board membership. And I think we should try to get them involved. When there's a major corporate sentencing, we might want a committee of institutional directors to come to court and make suggestions about what they think should be done.
Yes, we wrote to the major institutional investors after the two crashes who have great stakes in Boeing, and they wrote back letters saying, we understand we have a responsibility, but they didn't do anything about the composition of the board. Anyhow, how about this idea? What about a statute requiring companies above a certain size to have a compliance officer in the company, sort of a hot seat position, where the compliance officer has a distinct responsibility to have no deniability and to have knowledge and feelers throughout the company to be alerted to these situations?
Well, I think the general direction which you're pointing, I think, is quite sound. One of the things that I would do is take the general counsel, who today really is the leading compliance officer for most companies, and have him report directly to the audit committee so that he doesn't report to the chief financial officer or even the CEO. And that way you make him more independent and more able, and you give him instructions that if he is aware of significant noncompliance, he has a legal obligation to immediately alert the audit committee. If the audit committee is alerted by the general counsel, they're going to recognize they can't sit there and do nothing, or they have the possibility that they could be seen as having aided and abetted the crime.
And how would the statute make that more firm?
Well, you would say that the general counsel reports to the audit committee and not any executive officer of the firm. For example, right now, the accountants can only be replaced by the audit committee. That was something done by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the hopes it would make accountants more independent. I can't tell you that recent experience suggests that accountants are independent at all, but I do know that taking the lawyer and making him report to the audit committee and instructing him he has an obligation to inform the audit committee of any misconduct or any non-compliance with law would put greater pressure on both the audit committee and the CEO, because now there would be information in the CEO's superiors that maybe he was taking high legal risk.
Let's look at the bigger picture here. Do you think this is the time for a broad congressional revision of the federal criminal code, which is antiquated and mishmash and just not up to date with new technologies?
Well, I think there could be criminal law revisions. The area that I would focus on mostly is the crimes that require that you engage in willful ignorance, that you are willfully avoiding knowledge. That could be used in some cases. But if you try to amend the entire criminal code, that becomes a massive telephone book rewriting exercise that I'm not sure would have much of a specific payoff. I would focus on the kinds of things that would work, such as different kinds of sanctions, different kind of interventions the sentencing court could make, such as my proposals that you restrict incentive compensation, and also the area in which you are aware the crime is going on, but you didn't directly authorize it. That kind of person should have some obligation to go directly to the board of directors or forfeit all his compensation.
If congressional committees asked you to testify and be an advisor to them in this quest?
I testified for Congress on lots of occasions. I haven't necessarily gotten listened to, but you need really a scandal that excites the legislature. And sometimes we had that. The opioid scandal, I think, began to excite the legislature, but it got sort of short-circuited by the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, that's a massive corporate crime, which we're not going to have time to discuss.
Well, there's 400,000 deaths. That's more than we've seen from all of our current COVID-19 problems.
Yeah. It truly is staggering, and the Sackler family is escaping criminal prosecution as of now.
They have used bankruptcy to avoid personal liability.
Well, that's another big opening. Do you have any criticisms of the behavior of these large corporate law firms who handle these cases with the Justice Department and the SEC?
Well, of course, I believe everyone deserves counsel. Even if you're guilty, you should have a right to counsel. In terms of what the large law firms are doing, well, I think that, the biggest growth industry in the mega law firm world is the internal investigation. those things can cost up to $100 million. And some of our best law firms have made it their growth industry, doing internal investigations.
Explain that from the beginning to our listeners.
Okay, we talked about the deferred prosecution agreement. The way it usually works is that there is an implicit agreement that the company, the defendant, will hire an independent counsel, not their usual counsel, to do a study, and it will investigate everything and write a 200 or 300-page report giving us all the facts. Now, very good lawyers are involved in this, but when you are investigating the corporation, nobody wants you to have excessive zeal. They want you to go through the process of seeing who is responsible, but not to search whether there are clues that lead you to go up the ladder to find that the chief financial officer or the chief executive officer was responsible. And I think that one way you could make the internal investigation more objective and more independent would be to give the prosecutor a better, bigger role in selecting who the counsel was. Lawyers are very good at doing what their client wants. And if the prosecutor was partly the client, then I think you'd get reports that were more thorough and went in the direction that the prosecutor was interested in.
You know, the government does hundreds of billions of dollars in contracts with almost all these large corporations. Have you thought about using the procurement mechanism, which is basically a contract between defense companies, say Lockheed and the Department of Defense?
Of course, there's been a long history of this, because if you're a defense company and you are convicted of a felony, then you can no longer contract with the government. And the Department of Defense has to have the producer of its leading jet plane. They can't have that person put out of business unable to contract with it. So the government goes through these elaborate face-saving exercises under which they, when they do indict, they indict a small subsidiary of the company. So only it is barred. And the banks, which if they ever were indicted for money laundering, and there's good evidence that there's a lot of money laundering that's going on, they also could be subject to loss of charter. And that has produced this elaborate contortions under which they never indict the bank. They may sometimes indict a foreign subsidiary of the bank. I think that we need to have sanctions that will work, and the prosecutor has always been convinced so far not to indict major banks for money laundering because of even the, I think, remote threat that the bank's charter could be forfeited.
And this is a real perplexing problem for which it doesn't seem to be a known solution other than replacing the governance of these banks and keeping the bank operating fully and more honestly. There doesn't seem to be any other way, because as you say, if you get a run on a bank, it could have a tremendous domino effect.
Well, that's always the argument that has convinced prosecutors not to indict banks for money laundering, because it'll cause a run and they might lose their charter, and good heavens, that would mean all kinds of employment and other injuries.
Well, do you think this too big to fail, too big to jail problem is beyond redemption?
Not that it's beyond redemption, but I think that it is a problem. And I think you've got to come up with sanctions that would allow us to impose, frankly, massive penalties without those penalties falling on the innocent, without them falling on the low-level worker who will be laid off, with the small town that will have its mill closed, with the creditors who suddenly find that their debt is worth half as much because the company is now riskier. We've got to find a way to concentrate the penalty, either by focusing on executives or by using sanctions that are imposed in stock, because stock-based sanctions only dilute the shareholders and don't fall over and overspill onto other constituencies.
Do you foresee in the Biden administration a stepped-up corporate criminal law enforcement process?
I think relatively stepped up, yes, because it's gone down significantly. So I think we could see, again, we tend to be focusing on financial institutions because they get a lot of publicity, but I think the opioid scandal was probably the single worst scandal of government underenforcement.
Public Citizen put out a corporate crime evaluation in 2019 of the Trump administration, and they found that the prosecutors are not punishing corporations for violating agreements.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the prosecutors, once they get something done, they want to move on to the next case. They don't want to be in the business of supervising that corporation. The glory for a prosecutor is winning a trial, and they want to do, for example, much as I dislike insider trading, that's the thing prosecutors like to bring most. They want to have a very public trial against an insider trader. But there's probably more damage done by the opioid executive who sells opioids for all kinds of non-prescription uses.
But one thing that's interesting in your book is all the various ways you're trying to corner the way corporations and corporate executives try to evade the law or get away with violating the law. And I just wondered, when this book came out in August of last year, what kind of reception did it get in the media? And did you hear from anybody in Congress or the?
No, I haven't heard from Congress. And again, Congress is his hands full. Not every book gets much attention. And this was not published by a huge publisher who can really get the publicity machine going. It got a good deal of attention when Judge Rakoff wrote a review of it in the New York Review of Books, and that was a very favorable review. And of course, appearing on the Ralph Nader Show may help it too.
Well, indeed. It surprised me because the Wall Street Journal does corporate crime investigations. They've done a terrific job on the Boeing crime. And all these major newspapers, they're always reporting the opiate crimes, the security frauds, et cetera, the gouging of consumers. It's really surprising that they didn't give your book much attention, like they're not interested in resolutions, not interested in reforms, no editorials.
Okay. Newspapers like tabloid crime. They want the big headline, and I'm afraid I'm more interested in the somewhat duller problem of how do we get the incentives right and how do we really deter.
Well, how about right where you work? You think there's enough corporate crime seminars or courses in law schools around the country, and there are enough resources in the libraries there?
I think there should be more, but I will tell you, students are fascinated with white-collar crime. It's the job they would like to have. If you ask them what they would really like to do, they'd love to be a federal prosecutor pursuing some kind of white-collar crime.
And they don't have that many jobs, unfortunately.
That's true. It's hard to get them. They're competitive. And the budget, well, the government can't focus on only one kind of crime. The government's got to be worried about terrorism, drugs, narcotics, everything.
We've tried to get law schools to adopt corporate crime seminars. My alma mater, until recently, didn't even have a corporate crime course. And I suppose a good number of the law schools still don't have corporate crime courses or seminars. Some professors years ago would tell me, well, we don't have a textbook, we don't have a casebook. That's not true anymore, right?
There are casebooks, but that never was the problem. You needed someone who had some experience as a federal prosecutor. So I teach this with Judge Rakoff, and he was a federal prosecutor and a defense counsel, so he knows both sides of the fence.
And now Steve and David join the discussion with Supervisor Matt Haney.
Before we conclude, Steve, any comments?
Yeah, I wanted to read the vote no on Preposition L thing that obviously came out during the election because it's almost humorous in the intensity of its umbrage in a high dudgeon. So I just want to read it and get your comment, Matt, on how you responded to this. It says, this is the vote no on Proposition L. The heavily socialist Board of Supervisors is determined to drive business from San Francisco. Rather than tightening their belt in a $13 billion city budget, they're on the hunt for fake revenue. Now they've set their sights on directors of companies in a cynical attempt to round up revenue rather than exercise fiscal discipline. Why not tax sports stars at the San Francisco Giants, Golden State Warriors, and others that earn large salaries? No, because this Board of Supervisors loves to brush up against celebrities and sports stars as one of their perks of power. It's simple. The market sets the income for salaries, by and large, by performance or what others have prepared to pay for services. Executive pay levels are set by boards, and salaries reflect the fact that those jobs require competent, qualified people with narrow expertise. Why punish them? So how did somehow you were able to overcome that?
Yeah, it sort of speaks for itself. And luckily the voters disagreed with that as well. I mean, everyone can look at and see how harmful economic inequality is. And it is not rational. It's not fair. It's not reasonable for companies to be paying their workers near poverty wages while they take in tens of millions of dollars for themselves. And that hasn't always been the case. Decades ago, that pay ratio was not there. And an economy that is structured in a way that only works for a handful of people at the top is going to be one that I think rightly most people agree with and want to change. And this was a step in the right direction. It was also, it's hard for these companies to cry poverty when they're paying some of their people so much. So, I think that argument was, brushed away pretty easily. And our city government, does have, revenue, but actually does not have enough to respond to the consequences of inequality. we are not able to build enough affordable housing. We're not able to get everybody inside or get healthcare when these corporations are making, hundreds of billions of dollars. We just can't compete with that, and we do need support in order to respond. And now I'm the chair of the budget committee for our city and county, and I'm going to be grateful that we have a little bit more money coming in to be able to use.
Just to give our listeners a little frame of reference, in the 1940, the executives of the Fortune 300 paid themselves 12 to 14 times the ordinary wage in their company. 12 to 14. By the 1970s, it reached 30 times the lower level wage in their company. And now the latest figures are it's an average of 350 times. And some of these Silicon Valley companies have gone up to over 1,000 times. So I would say that Proposition 11 overwhelmingly voted into law by 65% of San Francisco voters qualifies as a slap on the little finger.
Can I ask a question? When you add up the tax base and the jobs that these Fortune 500 companies provide, are they worth it? Do they cost the city of San Francisco more than they contribute?
I think right now there needs to be greater balance. I don't think that they pay enough in taxes. In some cases they don't.
So are they costing the city? Does it cost the city more to encourage these Fortune 500 companies to either headquarter or build in San Francisco? Do they create enough jobs? Do they create enough of a tax base, or are they a drain?
They definitely create a lot of jobs and they pay a lot of taxes, but they also lead to the cost of housing going up and other types of impacts that are not positive. And so I think, I don't know. I mean, that's sort of a hard question. It's not so simple, I guess, of just a question of numbers. It's a question of what particular company and how they behave locally, and then, how we could try to create some more standards and balance. And some of that is making sure they actually pay a fair share in taxes.
And finally, Steve, our producer Matt Marin, and Ralph do a short post-mortem on Trump.
Doesn't it tell you something that this book is not a bestseller? This book is not being reviewed except in the New York Review of Books, especially since corporate crime is reported every day.
Yeah, well,
they're not interested in solutions, Steve.
Well, the numbers are so staggering. That's the thing. And while we were on, Hannah just sent us a thing, just came from ProPublica, where a former SEC attorney is suing the SEC over adoption of these amendments, I guess, that happened in September, that lower whistleblower awards.
Yeah.
And so this former SEC attorney has now sued the SEC this morning for those rules. And
this should be all overturned under Biden. Biden's got hundreds of executive orders he's got to issue to overturn Trump.
Yeah. I mean, Trump is just on he's sanctioning Cuba. He's just on this deregulation binge. Yeah. He's just kind of lighting a torch to everything before he leaves.
Yeah, it's Pompeo, too. He's a culprit on that.
Yeah. He's the appropriately named Pompeo. It's the volcano that is covering the city.
Yeah. Well, now, this is the week of pardons. This is the most fascinating end game for Trump. Who's he going to pardon en masse? Who's he going to pardon specifically? Is he going to pardon some liberal people who are in jail to look good? Is he going to pardon nonviolent marijuana offenders? Or is he too completely obsessed with being a two-time loser? So we'll see.
Yeah, he could have pardoned Assange. He could pardon Snowden, right?
He can pardon anybody.
Himself? Can he pardon himself?
No, not himself. But it doesn't mean he wouldn't pardon himself.
Right. Well,
the reason for pardoning himself, by the way, even though it would be overturned, is he can fight it in the courts for 5 years.
Oh.
So even if they say, founding fathers never envisioned this. If they did, they would have made it explicit. No man can be a judge in his own case. No one is above the law. But he can take it through the district, circuit, Supreme, back, forth,
Yeah. If he has any money left after everybody's jumping off.
If he's smart, he'd hire some in-house lawyers and pay him a salary. But he can raise huge money, He can raise $300-400 million a year. He's got total fanatics who'll just hit the button for him.
Yeah.
There was some reporting I think I saw yesterday that said that, I think it was CNN saying that Trump was, he had been advised that he could not pardon himself. And he said, well, if I can't pardon myself, why am I going to pardon anybody else? Like,
Oh, wow.
which sort of spoke to his state of mind of pardons, which is interesting to see if that pans out. But, if I can't have one, why should I give one to anybody else?
Well, he has to give it to his family, though.
Yeah.
By the way, by him saying that, that's his way of saying I'm going to pardon myself.
But even then, I think it was specifically referring to like Jared Kushner and saying, well, I don't, why am I going to pardon him if I can't pardon me? I mean, we'll see what happens, but it would be fascinating to look into his psyche if he decides like, well, if I'm going down, I'm taking everybody with me.
Boy, he's 6 days left.
Yeah. Hold on, people. Hold on.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting where